Okay, so in this video we're going to create a simple HTML web page that allows a user to sign in with Google. So it's nothing more than just this, just a button that allows them to sign in, and the Google pop-up will show, and they can choose an account, and they can sign in to your little web app with their Google account, and it'll tell them which Google account they have signed in with. And a sign out button will pop up, and they can click on that to sign out. And then they can create an account with a different Google address, or they can sign in with the same one. I'm going to use Joseph Blogman here, one that I just made up. And you can see now I'm signed in as Joseph Blogman with my Blogman Joseph email, which will be deleted after this, by the way, in case you're emailing it. All right, so very simple, just a web app that doesn't do anything more than that. You can see there's no CSS, it doesn't look fancy at all. We're not using a front-end framework, we're not using React, we're not using Vue.js, we're not using anything like that. In future, should you be learning how to use a front-end framework? Yes, probably. Particularly if we're using authentication and signing users in, then for the purpose of security, a front-end framework may well enable you to do that a lot better. And there'll be more functionality with things like React or Vue that you can use as well. But for today, we're just focusing on the skill only of authentication with Google, and we're going to use Firebase to do that. Firebase version 10 or version 9, it doesn't matter. For this project, it's going to work the same way. So Google authentication with Firebase, focusing on nothing more than that. Let's get started. So in order to do it, we are going to have to use a server. So this live server extension in Visual Studio Code, if you haven't got that, just search it up and install the live server. And that'll allow us to actually use a local development server just to get this working. However, you don't have to use live server. You can serve it up in any way you want. For example, if you took this web page and published it onto GitHub, then when you click on the URL for GitHub, you can click on it, and that's going to work because GitHub servers are going to be doing the work that needs to happen in the background. So, or you can use any other local server environment that you want to. But for me, I'm using the live server extension in Visual Studio Code. All right, let's get into it. So I'm going to make a new file, and I'm just going to save it on my desktop for now. And I'm just going to call this one Google auth.html because it has to be an HTML file, of course. And once the Visual Studio Code has recognized it as an HTML file, I'm just going to use the exclamation mark tab to give me some boilerplate code to get started. And I'll give it a title. I'll just call it My Auth App. And we're good to go. So as you can see from the demo there, there's nothing more to this web page in terms of the HTML than just a couple of buttons. So I'm going to have a button that says Create Account / sign in. And the reason for that is because the function that I'm going to attach to this button is going to allow the user to create an account and then automatically sign in once that account has been created with your Firebase project. Or if the account is already there, it's going to just sign them in. So this one button will do the same job. And then my second button is going to be the sign out button to allow them to sign out, assuming they have already signed in. And then I'm also just going to put a div in here with nothing more in it at the moment than just a message. And that message will just, for the moment, let's just say you have signed in. So kind of a success message there. All right, and there's literally nothing more to the HTML, except obviously I do want to be able to use these elements from my HTML later in my JavaScript, so I will give them an ID each so that I can actually refer to them later on. This one I will just call Sign In button with camel casing, so taking care about where the capital letters are. It's probably the number one error that comes up is when there's a capital letter in the wrong place. And this one I'm just going to call Sign Out button with camel casing there as well. And my div, I'm just going to give it an ID of message. Okay, great. So now I'm ready to jump into the actual JavaScript, which is what the focus of this video is. But before I write any JavaScript of my own, I'm actually going to jump into Firebase here, and I'm going to create a project in Firebase because that'll actually give me some of the code that I can use to start my JavaScript program with. So I've created a Firebase account. If you haven't, you'll need to do that. Just go to Firebase and create an account. And then once we're there, we can go to the console and just get started by creating a project. And I'm just going to call this Google Auth and continue. We don't need to enable analytics, and I can create the project. And once that's done, I just click continue. And then I've made my Google Auth project. I'm just going to use this HTML symbol here. I'm not making a mobile app for Apple or Android today. It's a web app, so I just click on that. And I personally like to just use the same name that I used for the project. So Google Auth, and then I just register that app. And now my app is registered with my Firebase project. And this code is important, but instead of focusing on this right now, I'm just going to go back to the console so we can see what else is going on in Firebase. We'll come back to this code shortly. So if I go to the console, you can see there's my project. In the build area, there's all these things I can do with Firebase. I can make databases, etc. But today I'm just focused on authentication. So I'm going to click on authentication and get started. And that brings up all the different possible providers that I can use for signing in and authenticating. Today I'm using Google. So I'm going to say enable and enable Google authentication. It needs a support email before it lets you go any further. So by default, that will just be the email of the account that you signed into Firebase with. And once that's set, then you can just click save. And now Google as a provider for authentication through Firebase is enabled in your Firebase project. So that's perfect. And down here you can see there's a tab for your users. There's no users yet, but once this app is up and running and people start to sign in, people, I just mean me because I'm just using it to test, they will show up here in this users authentication area. That's kind of where all the data for your users is going to be stored within your Firebase project. So exciting, very good. In here we've got the settings, the project settings, and if I click on that, then it'll take me back to the code that I was talking about before. So if I just scroll down in project settings, you can see this is all the code. Now the NPM code here I'm not going to use. This is probably what I would use if I was using a front-end framework and if I had some sort of local installation of Firebase. But I don't, so I'm going to use the CDN, and you can see there, as well as the script tags that allow me to just paste this code directly into my HTML document and have this as being my JavaScript section of my document. It's also got the actual web URL for the Firebase library, so that means I can just connect directly to the internet, and it means I don't have to install anything locally. So it's for a beginner project, it's a lot easier. And the config object, that is all the specific information for my Firebase project, and that is there in all of them, including the CDN. You can see that Firebase config object is there as well. So all I need to do is copy that, and I can literally just paste it directly in to my document, and then I am able to get started. So there's my script, there's my config, and I'm ready to go. You can see it's also imported this initialize app function from the Firebase library, the Firebase app library, and that is great. And it's also made a variable for me called app, which is using that initialize app function and inserting in there the Firebase config that is specific to my project. So that gets things initialized, and it says, yep, when the user is using this website, we're going to be connecting to a specific Firebase project with this config that I have set up in my Firebase account. So perfect. So I'm ready to go. I'm ready to now turn this into something that is useful for authentication. And to do that, I'm wanting to use not just this library, but I'm going to copy this whole thing. I'm going to import some functions from Firebase that are going to be useful for authentication. So I'm just going to paste that because it's going to be very similar, but I'm not going to import this one. I'm going to delete that. And also it's not quite the same area that I'm importing it from. So it's not Firebase app, it's Firebase auth. So I'm just going to change that from app to auth. That is really important because it's this Firebase auth library that I'm going to import all these really useful Firebase features from. So the first one I'm going to import is just called get auth, and that is just my authentication sort of starter function. So that's really important, probably the most important one to get the authentication happening. And then I'm also going to import a Google Auth Provider function. So this one's specific to Google. So I'm going to get my Google provider in there. And then I'm also going to import the sign in with pop-up. So these are all, please make sure these are spelt correctly, and we are using, capital letters. You see the Google starts with capital G, but the other ones don't. So sign in with pop-up. Just pay attention to where the capital letters are, because obviously that needs to be correct for these to work. And I'm also going to import a sign out function, as well as probably a really important one, on auth state changed. And that's going to allow me to monitor whether the user has signed in or out, or whether their authentication state has changed from being signed in to being signed out, etc. It's going to allow me to constantly monitor that. So that one's really important too. Okay, great. But that's it. So it's those 5 that you need to import, and that is all. So once they are done, I'm going to create a new variable here, another one. So you can see Firebase made one for me. I'm going to make a new one for authentication called auth, and that is just going to be my get auth function that I just imported there from Firebase, and the brackets can stay empty for that one. So get auth empty brackets, and that's it. That is my auth variable, and that's going to be useful for the rest of my code, just saying yes, I want to use the authentication feature from Firebase. Great, and then one more, just for now, I'm going to make this one called provider. And this variable is just going to store, every time I do it, a new instance of this one here, the Google Auth Provider function that I've also imported from Firebase. So there it is, Google Auth Provider. And I'm just going to store that in a variable so I can use that later on in my code as well. So that's specific to getting all that information from Google about the user's Google account. Great. So now that that's set up, before I start writing Firebase specific functions, I'm just going to do some more straightforward stuff in that I've got my HTML up here with these IDs. So that I can use and control these elements from my HTML, I'm going to make variables for them as well. So for me personally, I like to use the same name for the variable as I do for the ID. For me, that's less confusing. So I'm going to create a variable called sign in button. For some people, it's more confusing. So sorry if that's the case for you, but because you're sort of naming 2 different things that are with the same name. But for me, I like them to be the same name because it makes it really clear for me what I'm referring to. But this variable, you can call it whatever you like, but it's the variable that is referring to, or what I want it to refer to, this element from my HTML, which has the ID sign in button as well. So it's in my document, so I'm going to use document dot, and then I'm going to use this method, the get element by ID. So I'm grabbing that element from my HTML, and in my string quotes there, inside brackets, I'm going to name it as the ID, which is the sign in button. So that button, which has that ID, I'm grabbing it, storing it in that variable with the same name, and I'm going to do the same thing, just copy that code, and I'm going to do the same thing for the sign out button. But this time I'm going to grab the sign out button ID, and then I'm going to do the same for the message. So that message ID, I'm going to grab that as well and store it in my message variable. So document dot get element by ID, and then in brackets it's the ID that I want to grab, and in this case it's just message. So what this allows me to do is it allows me to actually use these variables to refer to these elements from my HTML so that I can control them later in the code. And you can see why that's going to be important shortly. In fact, let's have a look now. So if I save that, let's have a look at what the website looks like so far. I'll bring this in, let's open it up in my browser. You can see I've got these buttons and I've got this message that says you have signed in. That's kind of weird though, because I haven't. So I don't actually want to see that straight away. I also don't really need to see the sign out button because there's no point in a sign out button if I haven't actually signed in yet. So I want to hide this, and I want to hide this message when the page loads. I only want these elements from my HTML to show up later on once the user has actually signed in. So let's get that happening. Let's make that the first thing that happens in my actual main code here. I'm going to take this sign out button and I'm just going to refer to it here, the sign out button, and then I'm going to say dot style, which allows me to manipulate the CSS for that element, dot display, And display can either be like on, which is, we call it block, or hidden, which is none. So it's like to say I have none of it. I don't want any of it. I don't want that HTML element, equals none. That's what I'm saying. So I'm saying the sign out button display is going to be set to none, which means I'm hiding it. And I also want that message to be hidden. So message.style to access the CSS. This is kind of a CSS thing, the display, and that equals none as well. I want none of that message either. And I put semicolons at the end because I'm conscientious and thorough. Okay, so if I save that, let's have a little look. If I refresh the page, yep, there they are, they're gone. So I don't see the sign out button and I don't see the success message because I haven't signed in yet. So all I've got is just this sign in button. But at the moment, if I click on it, obviously nothing happens. So let's actually start writing some functions, some Firebase functions. Let's write the first one for when the user wants to sign in. Now, like you could see, I only want that function to be called when I actually click the button. So that's why I'm going to just create a variable to store this function in. And I'm going to call it user sign in. And I'm going to make this an asynchronous function. So the reason for that is that for this function to work, it kind of has to connect to the network, it has to talk to Firebase, it has to talk to Google. So I'm kind of waiting for things to happen before the rest of the function is carried out. If it's successful, something's going to happen, or if it's not, then there might be an error message. But making it an asynchronous function allows me to wait for those things, and it just allows it to be much more efficient. So we're going to use an async function for this. So the parentheses, and then just the arrow, just going to make it an arrow function, arrow pointing to the block of code that's going to run when this function is called. So what I'm going to do in this function is I'm actually going to use the sign in with pop-up feature that I installed from Firebase earlier. So in other words, if they click the sign in button, they're going to call this function and we're going to get that sign in with pop-up happening. So this sign in with pop-up function, I'm going to pass it just a couple of things in there. One is just the auth. So that's the feature that I imported earlier. So that's probably the main one. It's getting that authentication functionality from Firebase. And then also that provider variable that I made saying, yes, I want a new instance of my Google Auth provider. And that's going to allow Google to do all the work it needs to do behind the scenes and get that Google account authentication through Firebase happening. So auth, Firebase, and new Google provider in the sign up with pop-up feature. So you can see Google and Firebase are doing a lot of the work for us. We just kind of have to basically say, yes, we want to use these features that you have so generously provided to us for free. And that's it. So if that works, we can go straight to .then and create the code that we want to run if that is successful. So if it is successful, we're just going to put in this thing called, in brackets here, called result. Oh, by the way, just notice that I have my brackets for the then, but then inside of that, I've got my brackets for result. And from there, I'm going to do an arrow function to an arrow to a block of code. And what's going to run in there, we kind of, for a simple app like this, we don't really need that much. But for now, what I will do is I'll just make a variable. I'm just going to call it user. And I'm just going to grab this result thing. This result is what comes back from Google. So the result, if they've successfully authenticated, we're going to get this result, which is all this data from Google. So I'm going to say result, my variable equals result dot user. And to show you what that is, just for fun, you kind of don't have to do this, but what I would like to do is console.log this variable, just so that you can see, console.log, I need brackets, console.log user, and that's going to allow us just to have a look at the console and see all this data, all this information that has come back from Google once the user is authenticated. Because that can be quite useful as we sort of develop our app from there. Okay, so that's the user sign in function. If it works, but of course it might not. So if it doesn't, we're going to put at the end of that .catch. Just notice that I'm still inside the main function here. I haven't gone outside of that. I've just gone outside of the .then brackets. So at the end of that, I go .catch, and for the error, I just put an error here. And this is mostly just about, so I'll just do an arrow function here. So I will just make a variable here called error code, which is just going to equal error.code. And, you know, at the moment I'm not doing too much with this, but you can use those variables to, you know, display error messages to the user and things like that. So I'll just make another one called error message, which is going to equal error.message. Okay, and that's pretty much all I need to do with that one at this point. Okay, so that's my user sign in function. An even simpler function is going to be my user sign out function. So again, I'm storing this in a variable, and that is so that when I click the button, I can call this function. I don't want it running the whole time. I only want this function to run when that button is clicked. So I'm storing it in a variable. Again, it's an async function, like that, and an arrow to the block of code that I want to run. And obviously, as you might have guessed, in the user sign out function, I'm going to use the sign out feature that I imported from Firebase earlier on. So that's what I'm going to put in my block of code for this function. It is the sign out function from Firebase. And then all I need to pass into that is the auth variable from Firebase, saying, yeah, I want to use the authentication feature for my sign out process here. And that's as simple as that. I can jump straight to .then. And then in here, I can just write whatever I want to happen if the user has signed out. So I'm going to do a very basic arrow function here. And you know, you can do whatever you like if the user has signed out. For me, I'm just going to put in, for now, just to test it, I guess, a quick alert that just says you have signed out successfully, or something like that. Okay, great. So of course, in this block of code, you know, you can choose what you do for when the user has signed out. But I'm just putting in that message for now. And again, we can just, if that doesn't work, we can do a .catch for our asynchronous function there. And all we're going to pop in here is just the error. And, you know, we really don't need to do too much than that. So I'm just going to pass, basically an empty function. I'm just going to pass through there. Again, there's room for, you know, development and doing more with that. But today we're just going to keep it nice and simple. So that should work to sign the user out once they click the sign out button. Of course, at the moment, we haven't told the computer to do anything when those buttons are clicked, but we're writing these functions to prepare for us to add event listeners to those buttons so that we can call later. But before we do that, I'm just going to write another function here, probably the most important one, and this is the onAuthStateChanged function. And unlike the others, I'm not going to put this one into a variable because I don't need this one to run when they click a button, when the user clicks a button. I'm basically just going to have this one running the whole time. This one is always checking, has the authentication state changed? In other words, if they were signed in, has that changed to them being signed out? Or if they weren't signed in, has that changed to them now being signed in? So again, Firebase does a lot of the work for us. It's already sort of there. I've imported it in from the Firebase library. So that's pretty much all I need to do is just call that function. However, I do again need to pass in a couple of things. One, like the others, is this auth. I need to say, yes, I'm using the authentication feature from Firebase. But also I'm going to grab all this user data that has come from Google. Assuming they're authenticated, I'm going to take the information from Google about that user and I'm going to do something with it. So I'll make an arrow function, and in this block of code for my function, it allows me there to write an if statement. So I can write an if statement, and if they are signed in, I can do certain things and I can write whatever code I want for if they are signed in or if the authentication state has changed to them being signed in. And then I can also write code for if they're not. So the condition for this if statement, I'm just going to write user. So if user, basically that translates to if the user is signed in, if the authentication status changed so that they are signed in, then I can run this block of code, whatever that needs to be. And if they are not, or if that changes to them being signed out, then I can write my else statement and a block of code there for what happens if they are not signed in, if it changes to them not being signed in. So for now, I'm just going to keep that else statement blank. And if they are signed in, I'm just going to write an alert that says you have signed in. But obviously, you can see the potential here for all sorts of things that can happen with this if statement. So, we've got code that we can write for once they're signed in and code that we can write for when they sign out. So we'll develop that a little bit more later on. But for now, let's just save that. And like I was saying before, we need to add these event listeners because at the moment, these buttons are not going to do anything. If I click these buttons, these functions are there, but I haven't told the computer to do anything once those buttons are clicked. I haven't told it to call those functions. So I'm going to go to my variables up here, the sign in and the sign out button, and I'm just going to name those variables. So sign in button dot add event listener. So that means we're going to be waiting for that button to be clicked. So that's the event. So in brackets there, I'm going to put in quotes, string quotes, the event, which is that click. So once that button is clicked, then I'm going to call the user sign in button in this case. So if they click the sign in button, we're going to call the user sign in function that I wrote. And again, for the sign out button, I'm going to add the event listener. The event I'm waiting for is that click. And if they click the button, if they click the sign out button, then I'm going to get the, what's it called? User sign out function to run. So these event listeners are essential. Obviously, the buttons won't work without them. Okay, so now that that's set up, I think I'm about ready to test it and see if it's working. And to test it, I am actually going to need to use this live server extension from Visual Studio Code that I was talking about before. Now, once I've got that live server extension installed, you'll see there's a button down here called Go Live. Unfortunately, it's not going to work right now, and you'll see why. If I click it, it says open a folder or workspace. So at the moment, this is just an HTML page just sitting on my desktop, and that's not going to work for using the live server. So what I will just need to do is take this HTML document and put it into a folder or directory. So I'm going to create a new folder on my desktop and just call it auth. And then I'm going to move my HTML document into that auth folder. Now, of course, that's going to freak out Visual Studio Code because it's going to go, where's it gone? I can't find it anymore. And to show how much it's panicking, it's going to turn it all to red and cross it out. Don't panic as much as Visual Studio Code does. It's absolutely fine. Don't worry about it. It's all still there. We can just close this from our text editor, and what we actually need to do is go to File and open that whole folder. So we want to open that whole auth directory that we made from our desktop. We're going to click on that entire folder, and I'm going to click Select Folder, open the whole thing up, and there is all our same code. It's there. But now that allows us to actually use the live server. We can click Go Live, and it'll run that live server for us, and it'll actually bring it up in our web browser. So that's great. However, for some reason, it doesn't really tend to work so well. If I click that, the pop-up doesn't, or it does work, but then it goes away again. So there's some issues with just running it just straight like that. And it's partly to do with this. So I'm actually going to delete what it comes up there by default in the URL. And I'm just going to type in localhost and localhost and then colon, and then the number of the port that I'm hosting it on. So if you want to find that out, just go to Visual Studio Code, and you can see down here it says port 5500. So that tells me the port number that it's being hosted on. So localhost colon and then the name of that port. It might be the same for you, it might be different, but 5500, and then I click enter. Then it takes me to this directory that's being hosted, and there's my page there. I say, yep, that's the one I want to load. And then if I do it that way, it's actually going to function a whole lot better. So that's just a little trick that you might need to employ to get it working. So hosting it on that local host, let's test it out. I click the create account sign in button, and there come up my accounts that I can choose between. So I'm going to click my main one, and yeah, it's worked. So I have signed in. It says that I've signed in. Of course, nothing else is happening at the moment because I haven't asked it to, but let's check Firebase, and I'm going to refresh this authentication page with my user data. And you can see, yeah, there I am. My Google account is now registered in my Firebase project, and I'm now officially a user of this web app. So that's great. And at the moment, I can't sign out or do anything, so we'll add those features now. But so far, so good. That is working at the moment. Great. Okay, so let's come back to our code and let's see what we can do. So I'm going to add more to this if the user is signed in function. So you can see that once they sign in, that's where I want to show that message, and I want to show that sign out button. So remember, I hid these at the beginning. So I changed the display to none for that sign out button. Well, I'm going to copy that, and I'm now I've taken out that I've taken out that alert. So I'm going to show the sign out button. So I'm going to change that from none to block. So the sign out button style display is going to equal block, which means I'm going to show that element from my HTML, that sign out button, which was hidden before. And I'm going to do the same thing for my message. So that message div, I'm going to, instead of hiding it like I did before, I'm going to change that from none to block, and I'm going to show that message. So that message said you've successfully signed in, so I don't need the alert that I deleted earlier. So that's what I want to happen if the user is signed in. If they are not signed in, so if they, let's say they click on that sign out button and they successfully sign out, well then I want to hide these things again. So those things I don't want to show if they have signed out. So once they signed out, I don't want to see the sign out button, and I also don't want to see the message that says you've successfully signed in if they've just signed out. So let's save that and test that and see how that's worked. Come back to my app over here. Great, and because I'm already signed in, it's showing, it's working. So the sign out button is showing and the message saying you have signed in is appearing, which is great. So let's click the sign out button and see if that works. Yes, it does. You have signed out successfully. Okay. And then the sign out button and that message disappear. Perfect. Let's try it with a different account. I click the create account, and let me try as Joseph Blogman. Great. So now Joseph Blogman is signed in, and I can sign out as Joseph Blogman as well. So that's great, but what it's not doing at the moment is it's not telling me who I am signed in as, and that would be quite useful, so I know which account that I've signed in with. So remember I said before that we would log all that information in the console about the user data that's come from Google. So I'm going to right-click inspect my page, and let's have a look at the console. And there's a whole lot of stuff there, sorry, but if I come down here to this user data and expand on that, it has logged that for me in the console like I asked it to, and you can see there's all this information that's coming from Google, including all the bits and pieces that I'm not going to use, photo for my profile, etc. So I'm not going to use any of that, but what is relevant to me right now is this display name, which in this case is Joseph Blogman, and the email. As you develop things further, you can, all this information is there for you to use. So that's great. So that just gives you a bit of insight there. Let's get rid of that and let's actually bring it into my code. So what I'm going to do is right back up here in my message, I'm actually going to add just a little bit. I'm going to say you have signed in as, and then I'm going to put a span in here, and I'm going to give that span an ID of, let's just call it user name. Camel cased again. So, and I'm going to keep that span empty. The HTML inside it I'm just going to keep blank. But so that I can manipulate this, let's add this as a variable. So I'm going to say const, and I'm going to call it again just the same name for the variable, user name. and we're going to grab it from our document.getElementById, and the ID was username, and that's going to allow me to grab that little span. And so if they are signed in, coming back to my onAuthStateChanged function, if they are signed in, I'm going to add to my block of code for if they are signed in this username dot inner HTML. Like I said, there's nothing in there at the moment, but I'm going to inject some HTML in there, or some text inside that HTML element. And what it's going to be is the user data that I got from Google, this data that I was just showing you in the console before that I got from Google, dot, and remember it was called display name, spelled like that. So let's see if that works first. Let's check that I've got that right. So I come back to my, well, let me sign in again. And, let's use Joseph Blogman again. Why not? So if I sign in as Joseph Blogman, now you can see you have signed in as Joseph Blogman. So it's taken that user data, including the username, the display name it's called, and it's injected that into my HTML there. Let's just add one more thing. Let's add, after that span, let's add with the email, and then let's add another span, and we'll give this span an ID of user email. So once again, if I'm going to actually use that, I need to create the variable. So let's copy it and paste that. But instead of username, I'm just going to make it user email, and referring to the ID of user email. Okay, and then I can, in my onAuthStateChange function, I can add some code here to say that user email variable, which stores the element from my HTML, the inner HTML for that is going to be user.email, and that's going to grab that data from Google and get their email address that they've signed in with, and it's going to inject that into the HTML up here, in between here, for that span that I've put inside my paragraph inside the message div. Okay, great. So I'm going to save that, and let's test to see if that has worked. So yes, it has. You have signed in as Joseph Blogman with the email blogmanjoseph@gmail.com. Perfect. And if I were to sign out and sign in again as me, the other me, there's at least two me's, but just two that I'm testing today. Now I'm signed in as Keith Patterson with the email kpatterson@gmail.com. Great. So you can also see in my Firebase, if I refresh that authentication page, that I do have those two users that are now registered with my very, very basic web app. Okay, great. So that all seems to be working. Like I said, this is an introduction to Google authentication with Firebase. Obviously, there's a lot more that you can do with an app like this. We could make some CSS, we could make it a lot prettier, and then you can actually start to think, what do I want to happen when the user signs in? What do I want to show them? What do I want to display? Displaying information about their own user account, or just things that maybe they weren't able to see unless they authenticated and signed in first. So plenty of potential. This is just a starting point, but have fun, happy coding, and good luck.